2026. This is not a rescue year, it's a learning year. That's what came through most clearly when I sat with the guides about what lies ahead. What I'm sharing today isn't prediction or prophecy. It's an interpretation of patterns that emerge through yes and no spiritual inquiry, offered for orientation, not instruction. This is a long reflection, so take it in pieces if you need to. On the economy. When I asked about the economy in 2026, specifically how it affects people earning under $400,000 a year, the answers were steady, consistent, and very human. This is not a reading about collapse, but it was also not a reading about relief. Spirit shows that in 2026, most people do not feel economically secure, yet they also do not feel like they're in a free fall. It's a year of endurance and adjustment rather than recovery. Inflation does not ease enough to reduce overall stress. Housing and healthcare continue to strain households, and retirement feels uncertain. Financial anxiety remains a daily companion for many families. And yet, and this is important, jobs stabilize more than many expect. Layoffs slow down. Wages rise modestly, just enough for some to keep pace, but not enough to feel ahead. Food costs improve slightly, not abundantly, but noticeably. Enough to matter at the grocery store, even if nowhere else. Spirit emphasizes that economic policy in 2026 continues to favor higher earners, leaving many households feeling like they're working harder just to hold their ground. What stands out most is not financial relief, but resilience. People adapt. They redefine what enough means. They lean into side income, community support, and practical choices rather than waiting for policy to save them. Spirit repeatedly showed that 2026 is not the year people feel wealthy, but it is a year many realize they are capable. So, if you're wondering whether 2026 brings economic relief, the answer is not yet. But if you're wondering whether people make it through with creativity, strength, and growing clarity, the answer is yes. This is not a rescue year. It's a learning year. When money feels tight, people feel it everywhere. Economic pressure doesn't just strain wallets, it strains hearts. And when enough people are under strain, something begins to shift. So I asked Spirit, what happens next? Not in government, but in us. When I asked about the political divide in this country in 2026, I expected complicated answers. What I received was surprisingly simple. Spirit shows that in 2026, the divide between right and left begins to loosen its grip on everyday life. Not because people suddenly agree, but because many are tired of living in constant tension. Families find it easier to talk again. Conversations don't feel as loaded. The emotional charge around politics softens. Fear-based messaging loses its power. Media outrage doesn't land the way it used to. People feel less pressure to choose sides and more permission to step back. Empathy increases. not through persuasion, but through proximity, through knowing someone you love who doesn't see the world exactly the way that you do. So what changes and what doesn't? Spirit is clear. This is not a year of political unity. Differences remain. Opinions remain strong. What changes is the tone. Public dialogue becomes less dehumanizing. Personal relationships begin to recover. Younger generations model healthier engagement. Anger fatigue opens the door to listening, not because anyone wins, but because peace starts to matter more than being right. The divide doesn't disappear in 2026, but it stops defining us. And when the noise quiets even slightly, something else becomes visible. After looking at the economy and the social divide, the next question was about government. No personalities, not campaigns, but how governance itself feels to the people in 2026. Spirit shows that in 2026, government becomes more predictable, though not necessarily more inspiring. There are meaningful leadership shifts. Cooperation increases. Legislative gridlock eases. Things move, not quickly, but steadily. Executive authority expands rather than contracts. This is not presented as dramatic or chaotic, but as consolidating, designed to reduce instability rather than inflame it. Domestic policy places greater emphasis on economic stability over ideology. Education access improves. Social safety nets strengthen. Immigration policy becomes more balanced and humane. What doesn't happen matters. Spirit is clear that 2026 is not a breakthrough year for healthcare reform. Defense spending does not rise. Governance does not become exciting. What it becomes is functional. It's about trust and transparency. Government transparency improves, not because institutions become suddenly virtuous, but because opacity becomes harder to maintain. Public trust rises modestly, not from enthusiasm, but from relief, from fewer shocks, from fewer reversals, from fewer moments of what just happened. Governance feels more predictable. And for many people, that predictability feels like progress. Spirit does not show a perfect government in 2026. It just shows a steadier one, less reactive, more controlled, more focused on keeping the system intact. When things stabilize internally, the way a country engages with the world begins to change. After looking at what's happening within the country, economically, socially, and politically, the next question is about how the United States relates to the rest of the world in 2026. What stood out here was not ambition, but restraint. Spirit shows that in 2026, U.S. foreign relations move away from escalation and toward de-escalation. This doesn't look like trust. It looks like caution. Foreign policy becomes less reactive. Diplomatic communication improves. The emphasis shifts toward avoiding disruption rather than asserting dominance. This is not a year of bold global leadership. It's a year of pulling back from the edge. Here are a few examples. With China, tensions ease. economic decoupling slows. Military escalation is avoided. Cooperation does not fully return, particularly around global initiatives like climate and public health, but direct conflict is repeatedly shown to be sidestepped. With South America, relationships stabilize. Trade strengthens. Engagement becomes more collaborative than coercive. Spirit presents this region as one of the quiet improvements rather than headlines. Africa stands out not for conflict, but for neglect. Spirit does show increased cooperation, expanded partnerships, or mutual investment in 2026, not because the continent lacks importance, but because it remains under-prioritized. This absence is part of the message. Overall, Spirit emphasizes de-escalation over dominance. Avoidance of major conflict matters more than advancing influence. The global posture of the U.S. in 2026 is less aggressive, less reactive, and more internally focused. Spirit does not show a world at peace in 2026, but it does show a world stepping back from the brink. Sometimes stability doesn't arrive as progress. It arrives as restraint. But not all pressure comes from outside a country. Some of it lives in the shadows of power. And about the shadows, pressure, power, and containment. These questions weren't about what unfolds easily. They were about what threatens to unfold and then doesn't. This part of the reading looked at fear, power, and the places where rhetoric becomes louder than reality. And before I go any further, I want to be clear. This is not about predicting harm. It's about understanding where pressure exists and where it fails to become permanent power. I know this section may feel heavy. Stay with me. There's light woven through it. So first, threat versus outcome. Spirit repeatedly showed a gap between threat and outcome. Language escalates. Posturing increases. Pressure is applied, sometimes aggressively. But again and again, the feared outcomes do not complete. Military force is discussed but not successfully executed. Expansion is suggested but not achieved. Invasions are implied but do not resolve. Spirit consistently declined to show successful follow-through on the most alarming scenarios. What's emphasized here is not peace, but containment. And then there's intent versus success. Spirit distinguishes between intent and success, and they do that quite clearly. In several lines of questioning, intent appears real. Words are not accidental. Pressure is not imaginary. But intent does not equal outcome. Efforts to coerce, intimidate, or force compliance repeatedly fail to achieve their ultimate goals. Spirit shows obstacles, not dramatic ones, but practical ones. Resistance, oversight, external limits. In other words, power meets friction. Thirdly, shifting relevance of power. One of the clearest messages in this section was that certain trajectories lose relevance quickly, not because they're resolved, not because they succeed, but because the figure or force driving them no longer holds the same position of influence. As that shift occurs, many of the most alarming storylines simply fall away. Spirit did not emphasize how this happens, only that when relevance ends, so does momentum. 4. Internal force and accountability. Spirit also highlighted heightened internal pressure, particularly around enforcement and the use of force. This is shown as real. It is not minimized, but it is not shown as unchecked. Public attention increases, resistance grows, oversight follows. Spirit repeatedly shows that actions taken in the shadows are brought into the light, not immediately, but inevitably. Accountability does not ease harm, but it interrupts escalation. 5. Fear versus reality. One of the most important distinctions in this section is between fear and outcome. Fear rises quickly. Narratives amplify. Imaginations run ahead of reality. But Spirit does not show fear becoming destiny. The most extreme outcomes people worry about are repeatedly shown as not completing. Pressure exists. Tension exists. Catastrophe does not. When I step back and look at this entire section as a whole, what stands out the most is this. Spirit does not show a future without pressure. It shows a future where pressure fails to become permanent power. That distinction matters. It doesn't mean nothing happens. It means worst-case scenarios don't define the path forward. The shadows are not here to frighten. They're here to show where limits exist. Limits to power, limits to force, limits to how far fear actually travels. And just like the rest of this reading, this isn't about certainty. It's about orientation. Knowing where the pressure is and where it stops. With that understanding, we come back to something very tangible. Daily survival. This is section 6, and it's about food supply stress. When I asked about food shortages in 2026, I wasn't shown panic or collapse. What I was shown was strain, and how unevenly that strain is felt. Spirit shows that food supply stress does affect households in 2026, but not through widespread absence of food. This is not a year of empty shelves everywhere. Instead, shortages show up as pressure, higher prices, fewer options, and increased stress for lower income households. Spirit is clear that these challenges are driven more by distribution and labor shortages than by a lack of food itself. Fewer workers, fewer drivers, fragile supply chains. Climate, conflict, and cost. Climate-related factors do affect food availability, and global climate adds further strain to imports and exports. As a result, food prices rise, not just from inflation, but from supply stress layered on top of that. Government intervention does not significantly soften these impacts. Food assistance programs do not expand in any meaningful way. Where resilience appears, and what Spirit emphasizes most, is local resilience. Community-based food systems grow in importance. Local networks matter more. Adaptation happens closer to home. Food insecurity does increase despite overall availability. But by the end of 2026, supply stress begins to ease. Spirit does not show hunger becoming universal. It shows preparedness and local support becoming more important. Food stress is often where larger environmental pressures show up first. When we think about the environment and disaster challenges, I did talk with Spirit and I asked what might be ahead in 2026. The answers were more specific than dramatic. Spirit does not show a general increase in extreme weather frequency in 2026, nor does it show mass displacement or widespread infrastructure collapse. Instead, stress concentrates regionally. Disaster response systems become overwhelmed in specific areas, particularly those that are drought-affected regions, like in Central America, and hurricane-prone areas like southeastern U.S. Recovery efforts will lag behind the damage. Insurance costs rise. Vulnerable populations are affected first and hardest. Water availability becomes a regional concern. And agriculture areas face increasing climate stress. Environmental policy does not significantly improve preparedness in 2026. So there's adapting to it, and then there's awareness of it. That's what we need. This matters. Communities adapt faster than institutions do. Public awareness increases. Cooperation improves in response to shared threats. Long-term resilience planning begins to expand beyond emergency response alone. Spirit shows that environmental stress contributes to economic instability. But it also shows cooperation increasing where survival requires it. And when systems strain, the pressure doesn't fall evenly. The final area I asked about was the rights and lived experience of marginalized and disenfranchised people. Every question in this section pointed in the same direction. Beginning around May of 2026, pressure on marginalized communities increases across legal, social, and institutional spaces. Legal protections are challenged. Some rights are restricted in state or local levels. Courts play a central role in determining outcomes. Fear-based narratives are used to justify limitations. Opposition intensifies. And yet, this is where the message widens. Public resistance grows. Grassroots advocacy strengthens. Marginalized voices gain visibility despite opposition. Younger generations influence the discourse, and international pressure factors into our domestic decisions. Spirit shows a dual movement happening. Pressure and progress happening at the same time. Some rights advance even as others are challenged. Community solidarity increases. Long-term progress continues, despite short-term setbacks. Spirit does not show erasure. It shows struggle paired with persistence. It carries emotional weight and meaning. Before I close, I want to say this clearly and gently. This is not a prediction. It's not a promise. And it's not a directive. What I've shared here is an interpretation of spiritual responses, one way of listening, one moment at a time. Spirit does not remove free will. People still choose. Systems still shift. And the future remains shaped by human action. If anything, what came through most strongly wasn't certainty. It was capacity. The capacity to adapt. The capacity to soften. The capacity to step back from harm. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't. And let your own discernment lead. That too is part of the message. And if you're still here, listening, that itself is an act of presence. Thank you. Thank you for holding this space with me, where story meets spirit.